Persistent service asset, the Redeemer Dependent Dividend Ledger, founding rationale, archival copy.
Part 16. The Drone That Got In. August 14, 2026. Chapter 114. By the time anyone at the Skull realized that a drone had entered the restricted airspace, the drone was already leaving. It had not triggered the first alarm because it had not entered through the route the security system had been designed to watch. The Skull's aerial architecture was still under construction, and the security perimeter had been designed primarily around the dangers associated with the building itself. Unauthorized aircraft entering active maintenance volumes, autonomous systems losing their navigation references, construction drones interfering with one another, people wandering into areas where machinery could not safely distinguish between a worker and an obstruction. The security engineers had been thinking in terms of operational hazards. They had not been thinking about a journalist with a modified observation drone, a good knowledge of local terrain, and enough patience to spend 2 weeks learning how the blind spots changed as the building rose. The journalist had. His name was Julian Armenta, although almost nobody called him that. In Tulum he was usually simply Julian, and the people who disliked him had developed a collection of less flattering names that he wore with some amusement. He had been a reporter before he had become an environmental campaigner, and an environmental campaigner before he discovered that the most effective way to report on development was sometimes to let the machines tell the story before the developers could prepare their press releases. He had spent years filming illegal clearings, wastewater failures, mangrove damage, road extensions that appeared on maps only after the bulldozers had already arrived, and hotel projects whose environmental language became increasingly creative as the size of their footprints increased. He was not anti-development. That was one of the accusations that annoyed him most. He was anti-development that lied about what it was. He had interviewed hotel owners, municipal officials, ejidatarios, environmental lawyers, construction workers, architects, divers, biologists, politicians, and tourists. He had been invited to hotel openings and subsequently disinvited from others. He had been sued once and threatened with a lawsuit 3 other times. He had acquired a reputation for being impossible to buy and, consequently, had discovered that there were people who preferred to rent him equipment rather than give him money. He knew enough about local politics to recognize when a public consultation had been arranged after the decision had already been made, and enough about environmental regulation to know that a project could be perfectly legal and still be an ecological disaster. He also knew drones. His first drone had been bought secondhand from a wedding photographer. His current one had almost nothing left in common with that machine except the basic principle of flight. He had modified the navigation system, reduced its acoustic signature, altered its optical package, and taught himself how to fly it without depending entirely upon automated positioning. He had not planned to penetrate the Skull's perimeter. Not originally. He had planned to photograph it from outside. That had changed when he saw the quadruped. The first rumor reached him through a hotel employee who did not want to be quoted. "There are walking machines out there." Julian had laughed. "Everyone has walking machines now." "No, these are different." "Different how?" The employee had shrugged. "They don't need roads." That sentence stayed with him. Tulum had spent years arguing about roads. Roads to hotels. Roads to beaches. Roads through protected areas. Roads around cenotes. Roads to developments that did not officially exist until the roads made them impossible to ignore. A machine that did not need roads was not merely another machine. It was an infrastructure problem. Julian began looking. He found photographs of unusual transport crates arriving at night. He found a fabrication contractor whose corporate registry led to 3 different jurisdictions before becoming a dead end. He found a former technology executive who had recently relocated to Aldea Zama and suddenly stopped posting about her former industry. He found a cluster of new construction permits that did not seem to correspond to the public descriptions circulating around the project. Then he found the Skull. At first he thought the name was a joke. It wasn't. He watched the structure rise from the edge of Aldea Zama and began to understand why everyone involved was being careful. The thing was enormous. It was not merely a tower. It had the lower mass of a transportation hub, a vertical core and, above it, a geodesic exclosure that was gradually acquiring the unmistakable shape of a skull. The sun-facing surfaces were being prepared for solar collection, while the opposite side carried the mounting system for an enormous programmable LED skin. The whole structure looked simultaneously technological and archaeological, as though a civilization that had not yet existed had already excavated its own fossil. Julian photographed it from every legal vantage point he could find. Then he found the perimeter. Then he found the blind spot. The drone entered just before sunrise. The light was still gray over the jungle, and the construction site had not yet reached its daytime density. A handful of maintenance systems were operating on the lower deck. The first human crews were arriving. The aerial test volume above the skull was quiet. Julian launched from a location several kilometers away. He did not fly directly toward the structure. He approached low, following terrain that interfered with ordinary line-of-sight detection, then climbed only after the drone's passive navigation system confirmed that it had reached the outer edge of the security envelope. The machine paused. Julian watched the telemetry. Then he smiled. "Come on." The drone moved. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then the warning appeared. Restricted volume. Julian had expected it. He had already programmed the machine to back away if the system became aggressive. Didn't. The skull security architecture recognized an unauthorized object but did not immediately classify it as hostile because its trajectory did not intersect any active flight corridor. That was the flaw. Julian had found the gap between security and safety. The system was designed to prevent collisions. He was not trying to collide. He was trying to look. The drone slipped through. What it saw changed the story before Julian understood what he was seeing. The first images showed the lower deck. He had expected construction. Instead, he saw a machine environment. Autonomous carriers moved through designated lanes. Cargo modules were transferred between systems without human handlers. Maintenance machines moved along elevated rails. Human workers appeared only in enclosed corridors, behind transparent barriers that separated them from the autonomous traffic. Julian adjusted the camera. Pallet arrived. A machine accepted it. Another machine took it away. A third system inspected the transfer. There were no forklifts, no warehouse crews, no chaotic piles of cargo. The entire lower deck behaved like a nervous system. Julian's voice changed as he recorded. "What the hell is this?" He moved the drone higher. The image widened. The lower decks extended beneath the emerging tower. The geodesic structure above them was much larger than he had understood from the ground. He could see the beginnings of the solar skin. On the opposite side, the LED panels were visible as dark rectangular modules. He moved closer. The skull emerged. Not literally. Not as an ornament. The structure's geometry suggested it. The upper exclosure had the broad cranial volume, the hollow spaces, the tapering lower section. It was an architectural reference that could be read immediately without requiring a plaque explaining it. Julian had photographed Maya architecture for years. He knew the difference between cultural reference and decorative appropriation. He wasn't sure which side this fell on. Then the drone saw the quadruped. It was walking below. Julian froze. The machine had left the construction zone. There was no road. There was no prepared path. There was no human operator walking behind it. The quadruped moved through the vegetation at the edge of the site, carrying a compact load on its back. It stopped at a patch of uneven ground, raised one leg, tested the surface, and chose another route. It passed around a tree rather than through a cleared corridor. It crossed a shallow depression and continued. Julian forgot to speak. The drone followed. The machine kept going. Julian lowered the camera. The forest filled the frame. Then the machine crossed back into view. He whispered into the recorder. "It doesn't need a road." He watched it for another 30 seconds. Then he understood what he had. Not a building. Not a tower. Not even a strange transportation hub. A system. The skull was the visible part of something designed to move goods and people into a district without requiring the district to become a conventional transportation network. That was potentially revolutionary. It was also potentially catastrophic. Julian had learned enough environmental politics to know that every technological promise contained a second question. At what scale? 1 quadruped was interesting. 1,000 was infrastructure. 1,000,000 was a new geography. He began recording again. If these things are being manufactured at scale, he said, then Tulum isn't looking at another development. It's looking at a new transportation model. He pulled the drone higher. For the first time, he saw the entire edge. Aldea Zama on one side, the wilderness occupation on the other, the single road under construction, the skull between them. He understood immediately why the location mattered. The building had been placed at the boundary. It was not occupying the center. It was becoming the interface between incompatible systems. And then Julian saw something he could not explain. Beneath the lower deck, construction continued downward. The camera struggled to resolve it. A vertical service spine disappeared into the ground. Julian zoomed. The image degraded. He tried again. The drone system warned him that it was approaching the edge of the restricted flight volume. He ignored the warning. The image sharpened for less than a second. There was a shaft, or perhaps a tunnel, something below the building. Then the security system finally reacted. Julian turned the drone around. It escaped the perimeter less than 30 seconds before the aerial system would have forced it down. He landed the machine in an abandoned structure outside town. He removed the storage module. He looked at the footage. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, because he knew what it meant. He had a story. By 9 in the morning, the footage was online. Julian did not publish the entire flight. He published 7 minutes. The first minute showed the skull from above. The second showed the lower logistics deck. The third showed the aerial exclosure. The fourth showed the quadruped. The fifth showed the road. The sixth showed the relationship between the skull and the ground truther occupation. The seventh showed the descent beneath the building. He called the piece, "What is being built at the edge of Tulum?" The headline was deliberately restrained. The video was not. By noon, it had been copied everywhere. By 1, hotel employees were watching it in back offices. By 2, municipal officials were watching it on phones during meetings. By 3, members of the Tulum hotel sector had begun calling one another. By 4, the local Economic Development Council had requested the original footage. By 5, somebody had already uploaded a slowed-down version of the quadruped walking through the forest with dramatic music. Julian hated that version. It got 12 times more views than his original. The first official reaction came from the municipal side. It was carefully worded. The municipality had not been informed of any unauthorized activity. The project was under review. Relevant authorities were being contacted. The public was advised not to speculate. The statement produced exactly the opposite effect. Speculation exploded. Who owned the building? Who had authorized it? Why had the municipality not announced it? Was it connected to the airport? Was it connected to the Tren Maya? Was it military? Was it Amazon? Was it a private logistics network? Was it foreign? Was it Chinese? Was it American? Was it a data center? Was it a hotel? Was it a spaceport? Was it a Mayan cultural center? Was it a cult? Someone claimed it was a Tesla facility. Someone else claimed it was a new headquarters for a billionaire who had secretly bought half of Tulum. A third person claimed the skull shape was proof of an archaeological conspiracy. The video made everything worse because the footage was too good to dismiss. There was no obvious CGI. The machine was real. The building was real. The road was real. The wilderness was real. The question was real. The Tulum Hotel Association called an emergency meeting. The association had been dealing with governments for years. Its institutional history had trained it to recognize a particular kind of crisis, the moment when a development project became too large to remain someone else's problem. It represented hotel owners and operators before municipal, state, and federal authorities. Its public mission was not merely to defend hotel businesses but to promote Tulum as a high-end destination associated with wellness, culture, gastronomy, ecotourism, and sustainability. It had experience negotiating with governments over infrastructure, tourism policy, public services, sanitation charges, development planning, and environmental questions. It had also learned that Tulum's tourism economy could be damaged as easily by bad infrastructure and bad governance as by ecological degradation. Achalam. The meeting therefore began with an argument. What do we know? Nothing. That's not acceptable. It's been there for months. That's not what I asked. What do we know? The room fell quiet. The president looked at the video on the screen. The quadruped crossed the forest again. A hotelier leaned forward. Does it need roads? No. Then it could reduce road pressure. Another hotelier shook his head. Or it could bring 10,000 more people into the area without us knowing. That's not necessarily bad. It is if the infrastructure isn't accounted for. A woman who had spent years dealing with environmental permitting leaned forward. Everyone is asking the wrong question. What question? Who built it? She shook her head. The first question is what it does. The room went silent. She continued. If this thing is what the video suggests, then it changes transportation, logistics, tourism access, construction, waste movement, emergency response, and possibly the entire economics of peripheral development. If we start by treating it as a building, we'll be negotiating the wrong problem. Someone asked whether the association should oppose it. She looked almost offended. On what grounds? Nobody answered. That's the problem. The association had opposed projects before. It had gone to war over sanitation money. It had fought governments over infrastructure. It had pushed back against projects when hotel properties, workers, and traffic were threatened. It had also worked with governments and civil society on sustainability agendas and planning. Its institutional muscle came from knowing how to do both. The Skull presented a new problem. They did not yet know which side of that history it belonged on. At the Municipal Economic Development Council, the atmosphere was less philosophical. They wanted numbers. How many workers? How much investment? How much tax revenue? How many hotel transfers? How much cargo? How much electricity? Who would maintain the machines? How much land had been acquired? Who had authorized the road? Which companies were involved? The council's director watched the video twice. Find out who owns it. The legal advisor shook her head. We're trying. Try harder. There are multiple entities. Which ones? That's the problem. What problem? They aren't all in Quintana Roo. He looked at her. How many? Enough. She handed him a folder. There were LLCs, cooperatives, partnerships, investment entities, licensing arrangements, and names that appeared in different contexts without appearing to own the same thing twice. The director closed the folder. Who is behind it? The lawyer looked at him. That's not the question. He stared. Everyone keeps saying that today. Because it's true. She pointed to the video. Look at the machine. He did. It isn't designed for the hotel industry. No. It isn't designed for conventional real estate. No. It isn't even designed primarily for transportation. He looked at her. Then what is it designed for? She paused. I don't know. That was the first answer all day that he believed. The ground truthers were furious. Not because of the drone. Because the video had revealed the quadrupeds before the project had been ready to introduce them. They had agreed to the machines under conditions. They had spent weeks negotiating the ecological protocols. They had argued about what the robots could recognize, what they could carry, where they could go, and who would control them. Now millions of people were watching a quadruped walk through the forest without knowing any of those agreements existed. Mara found Julian that evening. He was sitting outside a cafe surrounded by 3 phones, 2 batteries, and a laptop. She stood over him. "You made us look like idiots." He looked up. "How?" "You showed the machine without showing the agreement." "I didn't know there was an agreement." "Exactly." He considered that. "Would you have told me?" "No." "Then we're even." She almost smiled. Instead, she sat down. "Do you know what you filmed?" "I have a pretty good idea." "No, you don't." "Then tell me." Mara looked at the street. "You filmed the first machine we agreed could enter our territory without a road." Julian stared at her. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if the alternative is a road network, I'll take the machine." He looked at the footage on his screen. "Does it work?" "We're finding out." "Who built it?" "That's complicated." "Everything is complicated." "No, this is actually complicated." He laughed. Then he stopped. "Are you afraid?" Mara thought about it. "Yes." "Of the machine?" "No." "Of the skull?" She looked toward the direction of Aldea Zama. "Of what happens if it works?" Julian understood. That was the first time he realized that the people living on the edge were not necessarily fighting the future. They were negotiating its terms. At the skull, the people responsible for the project gathered in an emergency meeting. The video was projected across the wall. Nobody spoke while it played. When it ended, Elise turned to the security team. "How did he get in?" The security chief explained. The system had detected the drone but had not classified it as a collision risk until it was already inside the observation envelope. "Can we prevent it?" "Yes." "How?" "Expand the restricted volume." The Skyfish representative shook his head. "That would interfere with our own operations." "Then harden the detection system." "Against what?" "Drones." "Whose drones?" "All of them." The room became tense. A Skyfish engineer leaned forward. "That would turn the skull into an exclusion zone over half the district." "Then what do you propose?" The engineer looked at the footage. "Nothing." Everyone stared at him. He continued. "The video did something we couldn't have done." "What?" "It explained the building." Elise frowned. "To whom?" "Everyone." He pointed at the quadruped. "People have been told for months that we're building a logistics hub. Nobody understands what that means. Now they have seen a machine leave the road and walk into the forest. They understand." The lawyer shook his head. "That's not necessarily good." "No." The engineer smiled faintly. "But it's real." Tomas watched the footage alone. He watched the quadruped 3 times. On the 4th, he stopped the video. The machine was standing at the edge of the vegetation. His head was angled slightly downward. One foreleg was raised. The posture was familiar. He knew it. Not the machine. The posture. The hesitation before choosing terrain. He rewound, played it again. Something moved behind his eyes. The PCU. A different machine. Darkness. Pressure. A sequence of movement. He closed the screen. Vasper was sitting across from him. "You recognized it?" "Yes." "Don't chase it." "I know." "What did you recognize?" He looked at her. "I don't know." She nodded. That was enough. Then she looked at the newsfeed. The Hotel Association was issuing a statement. The municipality was requesting information. The Economic Council was demanding a briefing. Environmental groups were asking for an independent assessment. Politicians were calling for transparency. The public was asking who owned the skull. Vasper read silently. Then she looked at Tomas. Everything just changed. He nodded. Outside, the construction site had become visible from farther away than it had been the day before. The rising geodesic structure caught the evening light, and the first completed solar panels reflected the last of the sun toward the road. The LED surface remained dark, waiting for the night when the building would finally begin communicating with the district rather than merely occupying its horizon. Julian's drone had done what the architects, investors, and diplomats had spent months trying not to do. It had made the future public before the future had decided what to call itself. And the people who now wanted answers were not only the ground truthers or the guilds or the investors or the displaced professionals who had begun making the skull their second home. They were the hotel owners whose businesses depended upon Tulum's future. They were the municipal officials responsible for roads, water, waste, and public safety. They were the economic planners who saw an industrial opportunity arriving without an invitation. They were the politicians who understood that a machine capable of moving goods without roads could change the value of land faster than any zoning map. They were environmentalists who could not decide whether they had just witnessed the most dangerous development project in years or the first credible alternative to the development model they had spent years opposing. And they were ordinary residents who had watched a strange machine walk through the forest on their phones and now wanted to know why nobody had told them it existed. The skull had been secret. The secret had lasted until a drone got inside. Now everyone wanted to get inside the secret. Chapter 115. The people who wanted a seat at the table. By the following morning, the skull had acquired something its designers had spent months trying to avoid and its lawyers had never been able to prevent: an audience. The road leading toward the construction site was no longer merely a route used by construction vehicles and autonomous freight carriers. Cars had begun stopping along its shoulder. Journalists stood behind temporary barriers with cameras and microphones. Municipal employees had arrived in official vehicles, followed by representatives of the Economic Development Council, environmental officials, lawyers, surveyors, and people who introduced themselves as consultants without ever explaining who had retained them. A small group from the hotel sector had come early, before the morning heat became oppressive, and had remained standing beneath the shade of a temporary canopy while arguing quietly among themselves. The skull itself seemed indifferent to the commotion. Its lower decks continued operating. Autonomous carriers moved through the machine corridors. Construction systems lifted structural members into place. The first permanent photovoltaic panels on the sunlit side caught the morning light, while the opposite face of the geodesic exclosure remained a dark skeleton against the sky. Workers moved through enclosed access corridors where human traffic intersected with machine traffic, and the whole site maintained the curious impression of a place already operational even though the building was nowhere near complete. The drone footage had changed the meaning of unfinished. Before the video appeared, people had looked at the structure and seen construction. Afterward, they looked at it and saw evidence. Every exposed beam became part of an argument. Every autonomous carrier became a question about labor. Every drone became a question about surveillance. Every quadruped became an argument about roads, land, ecological boundaries, and who had decided that machines were entitled to enter terrain where cars were not. Julian Armenta stood on the other side of the barrier and watched the crowd arrive. He had expected attention. He had not expected this much. A municipal official approached him first. "You entered a restricted airspace." Julian nodded. "Yes." "You understand that this may have legal consequences." "Yes." The official seemed disappointed by the absence of panic. "Your drone was not authorized." "No." "You could have interfered with active operations." "I didn't." "You don't know that." "I know what the footage shows." The official looked toward the skull. "What exactly were you trying to prove?" Julian considered the question. He had spent the previous night being congratulated by people who had not watched the entire video and condemned by people who had not watched it at all. He had been called a hero, a trespasser, an environmental extremist, a corporate stooge, a propagandist, and, most insultingly, a content creator. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," he said. "I was trying to find out what was there. And now I know." The official waited. Julian looked at the building. "No," he corrected himself. "Now I know that I don't know enough." The answer irritated the man because it was difficult to quote as an accusation. The emergency session of the local Economic Development Council began before noon. The Hotel Association had sent 3 representatives. The municipal government had sent 4. The state had sent 2 observers who insisted they were not observers. Environmental organizations had requested access. The ground truthers had been invited after considerable argument, and the Guild Coalition had sent Elise Moreau, the Skyfish Cooperative's operations director and a lawyer whose reputation had apparently been cultivated through years of surviving meetings in which everyone else wanted her to say something different. Vasper attended without a formal title. That was becoming normal. She had once spent her career entering rooms with an institutional mandate that preceded her. People knew who she represented before she spoke. Now she entered rooms carrying only her own authority, which was more difficult to explain and increasingly more difficult to dismiss. Tomas stayed outside. He had been invited but declined. The room was already crowded enough, and he had begun to dislike rooms in which people discussed systems they did not understand while pretending that their ignorance was merely a temporary inconvenience. Vasper understood. She also knew that Tomas had been watching the footage again. He had not told her what he had recognized. She had not asked. The old rules remained. The first person to speak for the municipality was the Director of Economic Development. "We have a situation in which a major infrastructure project is visibly under construction inside the municipality, with substantial private and cooperative participation, and yet the public understanding of its purpose is almost entirely derived from unauthorized aerial footage." Elise looked toward him. "That's accurate. Is it authorized?" "Parts of it." "That's not an answer." "It is the answer." The director's expression tightened. "Then let me ask more precisely. Does the project have the necessary permissions?" "Different components have different permissions." Again, not an answer. Elise leaned back. "The problem is that you're asking about a building as though it were a single project. It occupies a single site. It does not function as a single system. That's irrelevant to the municipality." "No," Elise said. "It's the most relevant thing about it." The hotel representative intervened before the discussion hardened. "Perhaps we should start with what it does." Everyone looked at her. She continued. "The footage shows 3 things we need to understand. First, an autonomous logistics hub. Second, an aerial drone facility. Third, a ground transportation system that does not appear to require conventional roads. If those 3 things are real, then we are not dealing with a conventional development." The economic director nodded reluctantly. "Fine. What does it do?" Elise looked around the room. "It moves people and goods." Someone laughed. "You built a gigantic skull to move people and goods?" "No," she said. "We built a logistics and mobility interface that happens to use the skull as its architectural exclosure." The room became quiet. The hotel representative smiled faintly. "That's a much better answer." The Hotel Association had not come to oppose the project. That surprised the municipality. It had come to determine whether the project represented a threat, an opportunity, or a threat disguised as an opportunity. The distinction was not academic. Tulum's hotel economy had been built around movement. Guests arrived through airports, highways, private transfers, taxis, buses, and rental vehicles. Food arrived by trucks. Linen arrived by trucks. Construction materials arrived by trucks. Waste left by trucks. Maintenance workers arrived by cars and motorcycles. Every hotel was therefore dependent on a transportation network that was increasingly congested, expensive, and environmentally controversial. The skull presented an alternative. The Hotel Association's representatives knew enough about logistics to understand the attraction immediately. They also understood the danger. If the system can move hotel guests from the airport to a hotel without conventional ground transport, one hotelier said, then it changes the transfer business. Yes. If it can move supplies, it changes distribution. Yes. If it can move waste, it changes municipal collection. Potentially. If it can operate 24 hours, it changes labor requirements. Elise looked at him. It changes some labor requirements. That's not the same thing. No. The hotelier folded his hands. Then let's not pretend it is. There was no hostility in the statement. That was what made it important. The hotel sector had lived through enough technological promises to know that every efficiency created winners and losers. If the skull reduced road traffic, somebody would lose revenue from road transport. If autonomous logistics reduced manual handling, somebody's job would change. If hotel transfers became machine-mediated, some drivers would find themselves competing with infrastructure rather than another driver. The ground truthers had understood this instinctively. The Hotel Association understood it economically. The AI-displaced professionals understood it personally. The three groups were beginning to discover that they had more in common than they had expected. Mara was the first to say it aloud. Everyone is asking whether the skull should exist. She looked at the table. That's already the wrong question. The municipal director sighed. Not again. She ignored him. The thing exists. The machines exist. The investment exists. The people working on it exist. The only question left is what rules apply. The hotel representative nodded. That is exactly what we're here to determine. Mara looked at him suspiciously. Why? Because if this works, my members will be using it. Your members? Hotels. You've seen one video. I've seen enough. Mara leaned back. You don't know what it costs. No. You don't know who controls it. No. You don't know what it becomes. No. And you still want access. The hotelier smiled. I run hotels in Tulum. We specialize in making reservations before we know what the room looks like. For the first time, even the ground truthers laughed. The tension eased. Not much. Enough. The politicians arrived after lunch. They did not come as a unified group. One wanted transparency. Another wanted investment. A third wanted to know why the municipality had not been consulted earlier. A fourth had already been approached by someone promising that the project could create thousands of jobs. A fifth had seen the quadruped video and wanted one. The local political ecosystem was already doing what political ecosystems did when confronted with a new source of power. It was trying to decide which constituency could claim credit for it. The most experienced politician in the room watched everyone else for 20 minutes before speaking. You've all missed the obvious. Nobody asked what it was. The project is not merely economic. He pointed toward the skull. It is territorial. The room quieted. The moment you can move goods without roads, move people without conventional vehicles, and operate drones from a protected structure at the edge of the urban area, you have changed the relationship between infrastructure and land. Elise nodded. Correct. Then this cannot be governed under ordinary development rules. Probably not. Probably. We haven't finished designing the governance layer. The politician smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. The lawyer beside Elise looked annoyed. We are not discussing sovereignty. I didn't say sovereignty. You were thinking it. Everyone is thinking it. Vasper watched the exchange. That was the moment she understood that the skull had crossed a threshold. The negotiations were no longer about whether the building could be constructed. They were about what authority it would possess once it was operating. That was a much more dangerous question. The Hotel Association requested a private meeting with the Guild Coalition. They met in one of the unfinished upper rooms where the walls were still bare and the smell of construction materials remained strong. The hotel representatives brought spreadsheets. The guilds brought architectural models. The first hour was almost useless. The hotel sector wanted guarantees about access. The guilds wanted assurances that the hotels would not overwhelm the system. The hotel sector wanted priority during emergencies. The guilds wanted emergency access reserved for medical and public safety requirements. The hotels wanted to know whether they could contract directly with the Skull. The guilds said no. Why not? Because the infrastructure isn't designed to become a private hotel utility. Then how do we use it? Through the common logistics layer. At what price? That hasn't been established. Who establishes it? That is being negotiated. The oldest hotel representative finally leaned back. You're telling us you've built something that can transform the region's logistics, and you haven't decided how anyone pays for it. Elise looked at him. We've decided how the system operates. That's not the same thing. No. The hotelier smiled. Then you're not as different from us as you think. Elise laughed. It was the first time they had genuinely liked one another. Outside, Tomas and the old Redeemer engineer stood beside the construction perimeter. The engineer had watched the political meeting through a secure feed and looked more troubled than amused. They're going to ask about ownership. Tomas nodded. And? There isn't a simple answer. That's intentional. Yes. Then what's the problem? The engineer looked toward the Skull. Ownership isn't the same thing as responsibility. Tomas waited. The people who built these systems learned to distribute ownership because centralized control had become dangerous. But distributed ownership creates another problem. When something goes wrong, everyone can say that their component was only one piece of the system. Tomas looked at the building. Who is responsible? That's what TLP has to figure out. The engineer paused. And that's why the Skull is dangerous. Because it's too big? No, because it works. Tomas looked at him. The old man continued. If it didn't work, everyone would go home. The municipality would condemn it, the investors would write off the money, the politicians would attack whoever built it, and the ground truthers would celebrate. But if it works, every institution that sees it will want a piece. Tomas thought about the hotel association, the politicians, the council, the ground truthers, the guilds, the professionals, his sister's trust, the old Redeemer people. Then it becomes contested. It already is. The first public demonstration was scheduled for the following week. It was not originally intended to be public. The guilds had planned a controlled demonstration for municipal representatives and selected observers, but the drone footage had made secrecy impossible. The only remaining choice was whether to allow the public to see the system under controlled conditions or allow unofficial demonstrations to multiply until someone got hurt. The ground truthers insisted that the quadruped demonstration take place on their terms. No prepared asphalt course. No manicured field. No fake wilderness. The machine would have to cross actual terrain. The Robotics Guild agreed. The route was selected near the edge of the occupation, where the vegetation was dense enough to provide a genuine test without placing the machine near sensitive ecological zones. The Hotel Association sent representatives. The municipality sent officials. The Economic Council sent observers. Julian came with a camera crew. The upper tier sent people who pretended not to be investors. The AI-displaced professionals came in numbers large enough that someone finally described them as a guild in their own right. Vasper stood beside Tomas. Her sister was 20 meters away. Neither approached the other. The demonstration began. The quadruped left the Skull's lower deck, crossed the road. Then it left the road. The machine's movements changed almost immediately. On the prepared surface, it had moved efficiently. In the forest, it became cautious. Its sensors scanned continuously. It altered its gait. It avoided exposed roots. It slowed near a depression. It detected a small area marked as protected and moved around it. The ground truthers watched closely. Mara said nothing. The robot reached the first difficult section. A limestone shelf. It stopped. The crowd waited. The machine tested the surface, then climbed. A hotelier whispered, "Jesus." Mara heard him. "That's what I said the first time." The machine reached the top, then descended, continued. No road, no operator, no human escort. The demonstration lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, nobody applauded immediately. The people watching were processing what they had seen. Then the Hotel Association's president turned toward Mara. "How many of these?" Mara smiled. "That's what we're negotiating." The public response was immediate. The footage of the demonstration spread faster than the original leak. But this time the story was different. The first video had shown something strange. The second showed something useful. That was far more dangerous. People began imagining applications. Emergency medical transport, food distribution, hotel supply chains, construction, search and rescue, waste collection, agricultural logistics, wildfire response, remote maintenance, cenote exploration, tourism. Everything that had previously required a road began acquiring a question mark. The politicians saw votes. The hotel sector saw efficiency. The environmentalists saw a possible alternative to road expansion. The ground truthers saw both opportunity and danger. The AI-displaced professionals saw work. The guilds saw civilization. The investors saw value. And the old Redeemer people saw something else. They saw architecture they recognized. Not the skull itself. The underlying system. The machine did not move like a new product. It moved like a descendant. A former God Mode engineer watching the demonstration from a distance paused the video at precisely the moment the quadruped altered its gait. He called someone. Where did they get the navigation layer? The answer came after several minutes. Pipe dream. He closed his eyes. That was the first time anyone outside the inner circle had connected the public machine to the subterranean project. He called again. Who knows? Not many. Keep it that way. He hung up. Then he watched the video again. That night, Julian received an anonymous message. No name. No explanation. Just a set of coordinates. He recognized the format. He had used the same kind of data in environmental investigations. He entered them into his mapping software. The location was nowhere near the skull. It was beneath the Yucatan. Not a conventional property. Not a building. A point in the cenote system. He stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. You filmed the surface. A pause. You should know what is underneath it. Julian did not answer. He looked toward the window. The skull was visible from the hill where he was staying. Its unfinished geodesic exclosure had become a dark silhouette against the night. On one side, the solar surface reflected nothing. On the other, the first LED panels had been activated for testing. The structure glowed faintly, not brightly enough to advertise itself, just enough to prove that it was alive. Julian returned to the coordinates. He knew enough to understand that following them would be dangerous. He also knew himself well enough to understand that he would probably go. He closed the laptop. Across town, the first emergency meeting of the Tulum hotel sector was being scheduled for the following morning. The Municipal Economic Council had requested a full briefing. Politicians were beginning to ask who had been left out of the original negotiations. The ground truthers were drafting their own proposed operating charter. The guilds were arguing over access rights. The AI-displaced professionals were discovering that their second careers were beginning to look suspiciously like the first phase of an entirely new professional class. And beneath all of them, below the arguments about roads, hotels, permits, and ownership, the system continued expanding. The public had finally seen the skull. They had not yet seen what the skull was connected to. Chapter 116. The second meeting. The second meeting was not held at the municipal offices. That decision had been made before anyone formally proposed it, because by then everyone involved had learned that the skull could not be discussed honestly from behind a desk in a government building. The first meeting had been about permits, jurisdiction, ownership, and the embarrassing fact that a structure of considerable size had managed to become publicly visible before the political institutions responsible for the territory had developed a coherent account of what it was. The second meeting had a different character. Everyone understood that the first meeting had failed to answer the most important questions, and everyone who arrived for the second had brought people who knew more about those questions than the people who had been invited to the first. The Hotel Association came with its own technical advisor. The Municipal Economic Council brought a transportation economist who had spent most of his career studying congestion and tourism infrastructure. The environmental representatives brought 2 biologists and a hydrologist. The ground truthers arrived with Mara and 3 others who had spent the previous night marking areas on a map that they believed the autonomous systems should never enter. The Guild Coalition brought engineers, lawyers, logistics specialists, and a woman from the newly forming professional guild, who had spent 12 years working on AI-assisted urban planning before the profession itself had become largely automated. The politicians came later. They always did. By then, the room had already become too interesting for them to risk arriving first. Vasper sat near the end of the table beside Tomas. They had not intended to sit together, but neither had made any effort to prevent it. Their relationship had become visible enough that people had stopped wondering whether they were working together and had begun wondering what else they were doing together. The speculation did not bother either of them as much as it might have once. There were more important things to worry about. On the wall behind the speakers was a projection of the skull as it would appear when completed. The model had been stripped of promotional lighting. Without the theatrical illumination, the building looked harsher. The geodesic exclosure was immense, its geometry evoking the human skull without attempting to reproduce one literally. The solar surfaces on the side facing the sun were integrated into the structure rather than mounted as an afterthought. The opposite side, intended for programmable light, remained dark in the model. Below it, the tower narrowed into the vertical core that connected the upper aerial systems to the lower logistics decks. The structure looked less like a building than a piece of infrastructure that had decided to become architecture. The municipal director stood. "We need to establish whether this project can proceed under the existing legal framework." The hotel representative interrupted. "No." The director looked at her. "No. That is the wrong starting point again." He sighed. "What do you propose?" "That we establish what is actually being built." The director gestured toward the projection. "We know what is being built. Do we?" Nobody answered. The woman from the professional guild leaned forward. She had been quiet during the first meeting, but she had spent the intervening days examining the architecture, the public footage, and the technical information that had become available through the various parties involved. "We know what the surface interface does," she said. "We don't yet know what the system does." The phrase changed the room. "The system," the economic director repeated. "Yes, the skull is a node." "Node of what?" She looked at Elise. Elise did not answer. The woman continued. "That's what we need to determine before we start writing regulations." Mara folded her arms. "Or before someone writes regulations that accidentally authorize something they don't understand." The lawyer for the Guild Coalition looked annoyed. "Nobody is proposing that." Mara turned toward him. "That's exactly what governments do when something new arrives. They put an old category around it because the alternative is admitting that they don't have one." The room went quiet. The transportation economist finally spoke. "She's right." The municipal director looked at him as though betrayed. The economist shrugged. "She is. We have categories for roads, airports, ports, warehouses, industrial facilities, and transit terminals. This thing combines elements of all 6 without being any of them. Then create a category. That takes time." "How much?" The economist looked at the skull. Less than you have. The Hotel Association's representative placed a document on the table. We have our own questions. The document was thick. Elise looked at it. How many? 37. The guild lawyer sighed. Of course. The hotelier ignored him. First, can hotels contract for passenger movement through the skull? Eventually, Elise said. Under what conditions? Common access. Meaning no preferential access? Not automatically. The hotelier looked toward the other representatives. Second, can goods be moved through the system without passing through municipal roads? Yes. Third, can waste leave the hotel sector through the same system? Potentially. Fourth, can emergency medical transport use the human circulation network? Yes. Fifth, can guests access the skull directly from hotels? Not directly. Why? Because the human circulation system is designed around protected movement, not private docking. Then hotels will need some kind of connection. Yes. That connection has to be governed. Yes. The hotelier looked at the list. Sixth, who governs it? Nobody answered immediately. She looked up. That is what we came to find out. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was not uncertainty. It was recognition. Everyone in the room understood that the question had finally reached the center. Who governed the skull? The obvious answer should have been the owner. But there was no obvious owner. The structure itself was divided among several entities. The aerial systems belonged to one set of arrangements. The robotic systems belonged to another. The land had its own ownership and contractual structure. The logistics architecture had licensing agreements that extended beyond Quintana Roo. Pipe Dream's underlying systems had their own distribution and intellectual property relationships. Capital had come from several sources, including the Sisters Trust and institutional investors such as Praetorian and Meridian Capital. The guilds had contributed technology and labor. The Skyfish Cooperative had contributed operational systems. Redeemer was present everywhere and nowhere. Its products had survived through other companies, partnerships, and jurisdictions. The corporation that had lost in Quintana Roo was not the corporation that had built every piece of the world that now depended upon its surviving technology. The lawyer finally spoke. There is no single governing entity. The hotel representative frowned. That isn't sustainable. No, he said. It isn't. Vasper leaned forward. Then the governance structure is the next piece of infrastructure. Everyone looked at her. She continued before anyone could turn the sentence into a slogan. The physical system is already distributed. The capital is distributed. The intellectual property is distributed. The manufacturing is distributed. The jurisdictions are distributed. Trying to force everything back under one legal authority would recreate the vulnerability that allowed Redeemer to become so dangerous in the first place. But leaving the system without a common governance layer creates another vulnerability. Someone needs authority to make decisions that affect everyone else. The economist looked at her. Who? Vasper glanced at the ground truthers. Everyone who can be affected. Mara did not smile, but she nodded. The discussion that followed lasted 4 hours. It was the first time the word council was used seriously. Not the Municipal Economic Council. Not the Hotel Association. Not a corporate board. A new council. A body capable of representing the different systems converging at the skull without claiming ownership of them. The proposal was immediately attacked. The hotel sector feared a body dominated by environmental interests. The ground truthers feared a body dominated by capital. The politicians feared a body that might acquire authority they could not easily control. The guilds feared political interference. The AI-displaced professionals feared that the entire thing would become another institution in which technical decisions were made by people who could not understand them. The environmental representatives feared that everyone was going to use sustainability language until the first profitable exception appeared. Nobody trusted anybody. Vasper found that reassuring. Trust was not the foundation on which serious institutions were built. Verification was. They began discussing representation. The ground truthers wanted territorial rights. The Hotel Association wanted economic representation. The guilds wanted technical representation. The municipality wanted regulatory authority. The Economic Council wanted development coordination. The professional guild wanted a seat representing the new class of AI-displaced workers whose expertise was becoming central to the transition. The Skyfish Cooperative wanted control over aerial safety. The Robotics Guild wanted authority over autonomous systems. The emerging TLP structure wanted a voice, although nobody could yet agree what TLP legally was. The discussion became ugly, then useful. By sunset, the first draft of a governance framework existed. It was incomplete. It was contradictory. It was full of clauses that lawyers would spend months fighting over. But it existed. The skull was no longer merely a construction project. It had become a political fact. Outside the meeting, the public was becoming increasingly impatient. Julian's original footage had been followed by dozens of imitations. Some were genuine investigations. Others were fantasies. People had begun flying drones near the perimeter, forcing the Skyfish security team to expand the detection network. Several commercial operators had been warned away. One had crashed into a construction barrier after its pilot attempted to photograph the upper exclosure from too close a distance. The incident became another story. The headline was absurd. Mystery Skull Eats Drone. Julian hated it. The public loved it. The video showed the machine falling. It did not show the pilot ignoring the warnings. That was becoming a problem. The skull had become famous before it had become understood. And fame was changing behavior around it. People came to photograph the structure. People brought children. Tourists asked taxi drivers to take them to the skull. Hotels began advertising rooms with skull views. A restaurant near the edge renamed a cocktail after it. Someone started selling t-shirts. The ground truthers were appalled. The upper tier was amused. The Hotel Association was furious. The guilds were embarrassed. The politicians were delighted. The project had entered popular culture before it had entered the law. The AI-displaced professionals reacted differently. They understood something the politicians did not. The skull was becoming a labor market, not a conventional one, a new one. Every public question created another requirement for expertise. Security specialists were needed. Environmental modelers were needed. Human-machine interface designers were needed. Ecologists who understood autonomous systems were needed. Legal specialists who understood distributed infrastructure were needed. Translators were needed. Educators were needed. People capable of explaining machine behavior to non-technical communities were needed. People capable of explaining human behavior to machines were needed. The professionals who had arrived after AI displacement began forming guilds almost faster than anyone could name them. Their meetings were unlike the professional associations they had left behind. There were fewer resumes, more portfolios, fewer job titles, more demonstrated competence. The old credential systems were still used, but they were no longer enough. A person who had been the chief automation architect at a multinational corporation might be asked to prove that they could work with a ground truther who had never attended university. A former corporate lawyer might find herself taking a course in cenote hydrology. A former AI researcher might spend a month learning how to repair a quadruped. A former executive might discover that the most valuable thing she knew was how to mediate between people who did not trust one another. The old hierarchy had not disappeared. It had become porous. Tomas and Vasper were becoming part of that new social layer without entirely belonging to it. Their investigation had begun to attract attention among the ex-Redeemer community. Some were worried. Others were curious. One former God Mode engineer invited them to a private session. The invitation was not sent through any official channel. It arrived as a physical note. No address. No signature. Only a time and a phrase. Bring no devices. Vasper showed it to Tomas. He read it twice. Do you know who sent it? No. Are we going? Yes. You answered very quickly. So did you. They went. The meeting took place in a house outside the formal district, an old structure that had been modified so many times that its original architecture had almost disappeared. The man waiting for them was older than the engineer who had been teaching them, and unlike that man, he did not seem particularly interested in pretending that the past could remain buried. He looked at Tomas, then at Vasper. You two are making progress. Tomas frowned. How do you know? Because people who aren't making progress don't make the people who built the system nervous. Vasper sat. What do you want? The man smiled. Nothing. Then why invite us? Because you are approaching a point where you need to understand what the guardrails were designed to protect. Tomas leaned forward. We already know. No. The man looked at him. You know they regulate access to information. You know they maintain continuity. You know overriding them can destabilize cognition. You don't know why the architecture was considered necessary. Vasper felt the familiar pressure begin. She recognized it now. Not a memory. A warning. The man noticed. Don't fight it. She looked at him. You're telling me not to override? I'm telling you that you don't yet know what you're overriding. Tomas looked at him. Then tell us. The old engineer shook his head. No. Tomas became angry. Vasper touched his arm. The man watched them. Good. Tomas looked at him. You think this is funny? No. I think you're finally learning why you need each other. The sentence irritated Tomas because it sounded like the sort of observation he would have made himself. The engineer continued. The guardrails are not a prison. Then what are they? Containment. For what? He looked directly at Vasper. For you. She felt cold. The room seemed to contract around her. Tomas reached for her hand. The engineer saw the gesture and did not interfere. You were not given those systems because someone wanted to hide a secret, he said. You were given them because the people who built you believed that unrestricted access to your own continuity architecture could be dangerous. To whom? Vasper asked. To you. She stared at him. Why? Because you were designed to survive things ordinary consciousness could not survive. Tomas looked at him. And us? The engineer's expression changed. You are not supposed to be asking that question yet. Tomas almost laughed. That's exactly what everyone says. This time I'm telling you the truth. The room remained silent. The man stood and walked toward a locked cabinet. He did not open it. Instead, he placed his hand against the surface. There are still God Mode PSAs in the world. Vasper felt her heart accelerate. How many? I don't know. Are they alive? Some. Awake? Some. Where? He looked at her. That's the problem. Tomas stood. What problem? The engineer turned toward them. Some of them don't know that the world ended. They left without another answer. Outside, the night air was warm and wet. Vasper walked several meters before speaking. He knew. Tomas nodded. He knows something about us. Yes. Do you think he knows who I was? I think he knows who you were supposed to be. She stopped. The distinction hurt. What about you? I don't know. She looked at him. You're afraid. Yes. Good. He laughed. You really are becoming impossible. She took his hand. So are you. They continued walking. Neither noticed the vehicle parked across the road. Inside it, someone was watching them. The person had been watching for several minutes. When Tomas and Vasper disappeared around the corner, the observer picked up a phone. I've seen them. A pause. Both. Another pause. They're together. The voice on the other end asked a question. The observer looked toward the distant glow of the skull. Yes, he said. They've found the engineers. He listened. Then, no, they don't know yet. The call ended. The vehicle remained where it was for another minute before driving away. Above the trees, the skull's unfinished geodesic exclosure caught the light from the construction site. The solar panels reflected the last residual glow from the horizon, while the first sections of the LED skin began their nightly diagnostic cycle. Below the building, the first deck continued receiving cargo. Below the first deck, the machine systems continued descending. And beneath all of it, beyond the part of the project that the politicians had begun demanding to see, Pipe Dream continued quietly extending itself through the limestone. The public had asked for a seat at the table. The table was being built. They had not yet realized that someone else had already been sitting beneath it. Chapter 117. The People Beneath the Table. The first official invitation to inspect the skull arrived 3 days after the second council meeting, and it was immediately obvious that nobody could agree on what an inspection meant. The municipality wanted to inspect the construction. The Hotel Association wanted to inspect the logistics system. The environmental representatives wanted to inspect the ecological safeguards. The Economic Council wanted to inspect the investment. The politicians wanted to inspect everything. The ground truthers wanted to inspect the inspectors. The guilds, who had spent months constructing a system that was already being divided conceptually into categories it had never been designed to fit, wanted to know whether the inspection would be technical, political, environmental, or simply theatrical. The answer, when it finally arrived, was all four. They assembled at the skull shortly after sunrise. The building had changed considerably since the drone footage had made it famous. The geodesic exclosure now had enough structural members in place to make the skull form unmistakable. On the eastern face, photovoltaic panels had begun filling the spaces between the structural ribs. On the opposite side, the mounting grid for the LED skin extended upward in a dark geometric field. During the day it looked almost severe, but everyone who had seen the nighttime tests knew that the surface would eventually become one of the largest programmable displays in the region. The lower decks were already operating. That fact had become politically awkward. The project was unfinished, yet it was doing useful work. Medical supplies were being transferred. Construction materials were moving through autonomous corridors. Food shipments were beginning to arrive through the system. Waste containers were being tested. Maintenance machines were using the service decks. The building had crossed the point at which it could no longer be treated as a future project. It had become infrastructure. The inspectors noticed this immediately. One of the municipal officials stood beside the freight entrance and watched a pallet of supplies disappear into the automated handling system. Where does that go? Elena answered. Depends. On what? On what it is. The official frowned. Everything goes somewhere. Yes, but not everything goes through the same system. She pointed toward a set of enclosed lanes. Medical cargo is isolated. Food has separate handling requirements. Construction materials go through the industrial deck. Hazardous materials have their own containment protocols. Waste leaves through another system. The official looked at the machinery. And people? People don't enter here. Why? Because this is a machine environment. These machines are autonomous. That's why. He looked at her. I don't understand. Elena smiled. You will. They continued walking. The inspection group passed through a sealed corridor that allowed them to see the freight deck without entering it. Autonomous carriers moved beneath them. Their movements were quiet, deliberate, and almost unnervingly coordinated. No human shouted instructions. No forklifts reversed with warning beepers. No workers dragged pallets across concrete. The system did not look like a warehouse that had been automated. It looked like something that had been designed without assuming humans would be doing the work. That distinction made several people uncomfortable. The Hotel Association representative noticed it first. This would eliminate an enormous amount of manual handling. Yes. And you expect the hotel sector to use it? Yes. Then we need to talk about labor. We do. Before the system expands. Elena nodded. Absolutely. The hotelier looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and respect. You don't sound afraid of that conversation. I was laid off by an AI system. The woman blinked. Elena continued walking. I've had the conversation already. The ground truthers had insisted on controlling the second portion of the inspection. They led the group out through the western access point, away from the completed road and toward the terrain that the Skull's autonomous systems would eventually have permission to enter. The difference between the engineered surface and the wilderness was almost comically abrupt. One step placed a person's boot on compacted construction material. The next placed it on damp limestone and leaf litter. Mara stopped. This is where your map stops. The municipal surveyor looked at the digital map on his tablet. It doesn't. It does. He showed her the screen. The official boundary line continued through the forest. Mara pointed toward the ground. Your legal boundary continues. Your operational map doesn't. He looked more closely. She was right. The ecological data layer ended at the edge of the construction zone. Why? Because nobody asked us to map the rest. The surveyor looked at Elise. Elise looked at the robotics engineer. The robotics engineer looked embarrassed. We assumed we had enough. Mara shook her head. Enough for what? Nobody answered. She walked farther into the forest. The group followed. The terrain became uneven almost immediately. Roots crossed the path. Limestone shelves appeared without warning. The vegetation thickened. The sound of the construction site diminished behind them. This is why we argued about the robots, Mara said. Not because we hate them, because you people keep designing from the road outward. She looked at the robotics engineer. Your machine needs to learn from here inward. The engineer nodded slowly. I understand. No, you don't yet. She crouched beside a small depression. Look. He crouched beside her. There was water beneath the leaves. Not much. Enough. This fills during the wet season. If the machine repeatedly crosses here, it changes the soil. If it changes the soil, the water moves differently. If the water moves differently, something downstream changes. You don't need a road to damage a place. The engineer looked at the machine's ecological model. The model had no representation of the depression. He stared at it. You're right. Mara stood. Good. He looked embarrassed. That doesn't happen often. Being right. Admitting the machine is wrong. Mara smiled. Get used to it. The first quadruped demonstration under the new rules happened an hour later. This time the machine was not given a predetermined route. The ground truthers had provided the ecological constraints. The robot would have to choose its own path. The demonstration was being observed by municipal officials, hotel representatives, guild members, politicians, and several journalists who had been allowed to attend after the drone incident. Julian was there too. He had been granted access under conditions that would have been insulting if they had not been so carefully negotiated. He could film. He could not interfere with the systems. He could not publish the location of sensitive ecological sites. He could not release technical details that could compromise the safety of the aerial network. He had agreed. Nobody trusted him. He trusted nobody. It was an arrangement everyone understood. The quadruped entered the forest. It moved slowly. The machine's head rotated continuously as its sensors built a local model. It identified a path that appeared clear and began moving toward it. Then it stopped. The operator looked at the diagnostic display. What happened? The robotics engineer frowned. It's refusing the route. Why? I don't know. Mara stepped closer. There's a nesting site. The engineer looked at the map. Where? She pointed. The machine had detected something invisible to the humans. A small bird's nest lay beneath a cluster of leaves. The machine rerouted. The hotel representative watched the robot disappear between the trees. How did it know? The ground truther shrugged. We taught it. The hotelier looked toward the robotics engineer. That's not what you told us. What did we tell you? That it could navigate. The engineer smiled. It can. No, you said it could navigate terrain. That's different. Yes. The hotelier looked at Mara. How much of this is your work? More every day. That answer caused several people to exchange glances. The machine had not merely been programmed by engineers. It was learning from people whose expertise had never been represented in conventional robotics datasets. The ground truthers were becoming part of the machine's intelligence. That was a fact nobody had anticipated when the project began. The political delegation arrived just as the demonstration ended. They were led by a state representative who had spent most of the previous week making public statements about transparency. He had come prepared. He had brought lawyers. He had brought cameras. He had brought a speech. He had also brought a proposal. The proposal was called the Tulum Advanced Infrastructure Authority. Nobody liked the name. The municipal director objected immediately. We don't need another authority. The state representative smiled. You need one whether you like it or not. Elise looked at him. That's an interesting way to introduce yourself. I'm trying to establish a regulatory framework. By creating an authority that wasn't requested? By recognizing an authority that already exists in practice. Vasper watched him. She recognized the maneuver. He wasn't actually proposing to create the authority. He was trying to position himself as the person who would create it. That was different. The ground truthers understood it too. Mara folded her arms. Who appoints the board? The politician answered. The relevant governmental bodies. Which means? The state. And the municipality? Of course. And the communities? Through consultation. Mara laughed. Then no. The politician's smile disappeared. What do you propose? Representation. Of whom? Everyone whose life changes because of the system. He gestured toward the skull. That could be hundreds of thousands of people. Then the system needs a way to represent hundreds of thousands of people. You can't govern infrastructure by committee. No, Mara said. But you can govern infrastructure without pretending that the people affected by it are a committee of one. The argument might have escalated if Vasper had not intervened. She had learned to recognize the moment when two people were no longer negotiating with one another, but with the audiences they imagined standing behind them. Perhaps, she said, we should stop arguing about the name. The politician looked at her. Then what should we discuss? Functions. She walked toward the table. What does the authority need to do? Regulate. Too broad. Ensure compliance. With what? Environmental, transportation, and safety requirements. Good. What else? He hesitated. Coordinate infrastructure. Good. Manage access. Good. Collect fees. There it was. Vasper nodded. Now we have something real. The room relaxed. She continued. Who gets paid? Who pays? Who can refuse service? Who can demand emergency access? Who controls data? Who can inspect the autonomous systems? Who can modify ecological constraints? Who can suspend operations? Who can authorize expansion? Who owns the records? Who can audit the algorithms? Who has the right to know what the system is doing? The politician stared at her. That's a lot. Yes. And you expect one authority to do all of that? No. She looked toward the skull. I expect the authority to know which of those things belong to which institution. That was the beginning of the governance model. Not a single authority, a layered one. The municipality retained powers it already possessed. The state retained its jurisdiction. The ground truthers acquired defined territorial protections. The guilds retained technical responsibilities. The Skyfish Cooperative controlled aerial operating standards within the system. The Robotics Guild maintained autonomous mobility standards. The hotel sector gained representation on commercial access and tourism integration. The professional guilds gained representation on labor transition and professional participation. The TLP steering structure would eventually become the layer responsible for the larger distributed system. And above all of it, a public audit mechanism would be established. The proposal was ugly. It was complicated. It was almost impossible to explain in a press release. That was precisely why it had a chance of working. That afternoon, the first politician climbed the skull. The route was not glamorous. There were temporary stairs, enclosed lifts, and unfinished corridors. The politician had expected a ceremonial platform. Instead, he found himself standing inside a service deck while autonomous systems moved below and around him. He looked through the transparent wall. The building's lower machinery was enormous. He watched a cargo unit enter one lane and disappear beneath another. How much of this is automated? Almost all of it. Almost. Maintenance still requires humans. For now. The engineer did not answer. The politician smiled. You know what people are saying. Yes. They think this is the beginning of the end of ordinary work. The engineer looked at him. Some work. That's not what I asked. No. The politician turned back toward the machines. You're building something that will make labor cheaper. We're building something that makes certain labor unnecessary. Same thing. No. The engineer pointed toward a technician working in an adjacent compartment. Her job didn't exist 5 years ago. The politician watched. What does she do? She supervises autonomous failure recovery. Meaning, she doesn't move cargo. She watches machines move cargo and intervenes when their behavior doesn't match the system's expectations. The politician considered this. So she's a supervisor. Not exactly. Engineer. Not exactly. Operator. Not exactly. What is she? The engineer smiled. That's the problem. The politician looked at him. Is that why the displaced professionals are here? Partly. They're becoming something new. Yes. Do you know what? Not yet. The politician laughed. At least you're honest. The engineer looked toward the unfinished skull. Honesty is cheaper than rebuilding the wrong thing. The Hotel Association's representatives spent the rest of the day examining the passenger systems. They were impressed. They tried not to show it. The human circulation deck was nearly finished, and its design was radically different from an airport terminal. There were no sprawling check-in counters, no long queues, no exposed loading zones. Passenger movement was compartmentalized, enclosed, and adaptive. A person entering the system would be identified, routed, and moved according to destination and needs. A hotel representative asked whether a guest could simply arrive and walk out. Yes. Without a driver? Yes. Without a taxi? Yes. Without a human concierge? If they want one, they can request one. The hotelier frowned. Then what happens to hospitality? The Elena who had been listening stepped in. That depends on what you think hospitality is. The hotelier looked at her. She continued, If hospitality means making someone wait in a line because the system requires it, then hospitality disappears. If it means understanding what someone needs when they arrive somewhere unfamiliar, then the system creates more opportunity for it. The hotelier smiled. You really believe that? I've been replaced by a machine. So you think machines are good? No. She looked toward the passenger corridor. I think machines are machines. People decide what they're for. The hotelier nodded. That's a dangerous belief. Yes. They both smiled. Near sunset, the skull's first complete section of LED skin came alive. The test had been scheduled for midnight. The engineers had not told anyone. The panels illuminated one by one. The effect was not bright. It was subtle. The skull appeared in the darkness without becoming a billboard. Its geometric structure remained visible behind the light. The Maya reference became clearer at night, not because the building reproduced ancient imagery, but because the programmable surface allowed patterns to move across the exclosure in ways that suggested ceremonial geometry without copying it. People stopped along the road. Cars slowed. Someone began filming. Within minutes, the images were online. The skull had become a landmark. There was no going back. Tomas and Vasper watched from an upper deck. The light moved across the structure. Vasper leaned against the railing. I used to think I understood what diplomacy was. Tomas looked at her. You were good at it. I was exceptional. He smiled. That's true. She looked toward him. I thought diplomacy meant moving between positions until everyone could live with the result. And now I think it means knowing when the positions themselves are wrong. He nodded. She continued. I spent years making myself redundant because I thought that was the highest form of usefulness. Build the replacement. Train the replacement. Leave the system stronger than you found it. And I didn't realize I was also leaving myself nowhere to go. Tomas looked at the skull. You came here? Yes. Why? She looked at him. Because you did. He did not answer. She smiled. Don't make it profound. I wasn't going to. You were. I was going to say I think I came here because you were the first person who didn't ask me to be useful. She was quiet. Then she reached for his hand. They stood together while the light moved across the structure. Neither knew what had happened to them. Neither knew what they would find if they forced the remaining doors open. But they were beginning to understand something else. Whatever had been done to their consciousnesses, whatever God mode had intended, whatever the old engineers had feared, whatever histories remained buried behind the omniscient gatekeeper, their lives now contained something the original architecture could never have anticipated. Choice. At the far edge of the district, Julian watched the skull's lights from a rooftop. He had received another message. This time there were coordinates and a single sentence. The machines below are older than the building. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked toward the skull. The first instinct of the reporter in him was to publish. The second was to investigate. The third, which had become increasingly difficult to ignore, was fear. He put the phone away. Below him, a hotel shuttle moved along the road. Above it, a drone crossed the sky. Beyond the road, one of the quadrupeds moved through the darkness without headlights. 3 transportation systems. 1 road. 1 building. A district changing around them. Julian understood that he had stumbled into something far larger than a development story. The question was whether the people who built it understood that too. He decided to find out before publishing anything else. That decision would cost him more than he knew, because the next morning, somebody would discover that the coordinates he had received were not merely directions. They were an invitation, discussion about...
Here's a hashtag string tailored for Substack and X. Hashtag Redeemer, hashtag God Mode, hashtag Ultra Rescue, hashtag UHNWI, hashtag Chrome Salvation, hashtag Post-Human Peace, hashtag Ascension Protocol, hashtag Non-Personhood, hashtag Lease Your Soul, hashtag VIP Extraction, hashtag Covenant Economy, hashtag Tactical Redemption, hashtag MXDN, hashtag VJTSU, hashtag Newest Newsnet, hashtag The End of the World is Cancelled, Red Heart Publish It Loud. You're changing the game.
This isn't a drop.
NFPs
Position
are
is
here.
not a print.
Signed,
Position.
priced,
MXTM
split.
Studio.
Tomorrow's Canon. This isn't a soundtrack to a single story. It's the soundtrack to an entire civilization.
Every generation inherits unfinished work. We continue.
We continue. We remember. We restore. We become.
The continuance, built by the past. The continuance, the unfinished civilization that outlived themselves.
The longevity principality, where health is infrastructure, where dignity is law, and tomorrow is design.
The future doesn't belong to the strongest, but to the most competent.
Deep beneath the waves, the Redeemer Oceanic team activates Project Cetacean. The integration is a success. Systems are coming online.
2 species, 1 mission. Protecting the formation. Secure the future.
For the longevity principality, success isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of consequences.
The Longevity Principality. A civilization built on healthy time, institutions, and responsibility.
Initiate the final protocol.
Not just survival, not just progress. A civilization that outperforms the world.
You want the code, you want the light, you face the Empress in the cyber night.